들어가 보도록 하겠습니다. So we're all good to go, I think.
Yes.
Okay, so John, it's such a pleasure to be here and see your workshop in person. It's just incredible.
Well, it's so good to have you here.
Yeah.
I wish I'd had more time to clean.
It's all natural. So I think the name Circa guitars sounds quite meaningful. So can you share the story behind it and what led you to start building on your own?
Well, what led me to start building was I was going to school, studying comparative religion and culture, like mostly American culture, and decided I didn't really want to be an academic and wasn't sure what I wanted to do with myself. And I discovered that my grandmother had left me some money for school, but nobody had ever told me about that. So I thought I'd spend some of that money, which wasn't a lot, but I thought, I'm going to take a break, take a year off, kind of decide which direction I want to go. And I wanted to travel to Asia because I'd been studying, comparative religion, and I was like, I want to go to India. Anyway, so I did that trip and came back and realized I hadn't figured anything out. My trip didn't clear my brain. I was just as confused when I got back. So I went to work for a friend of mine who was running a machine shop. And I thought, okay, I'll just do a little bit of this for a while, and then eventually I'll get back to school. But I discovered I really loved making stuff. Now we were making railings for big hotels. And I was, I wasn't doing any welding, but it's a welding shop, and we were assembling railings and ornate, like centerpieces for the rails, and all of that was being welded together. And I was grinding the welds and chopping parts and stuff. And for some reason, just like my brain just really worked, like giving an assignment, chopping things accurately, doing some machine work on a mill, and a little bit of lathe work, but not much. And I just really liked doing that. I liked the challenge of being really productive, of working hard and trying to get the quotas and all that stuff, and not really thinking about too abstract stuff, which is what I was doing at school. And my brilliant wife said, well, you're obsessed with music and you like making things. Why don't you try to put those two things together? So that's how I decided, okay, maybe I'll do something with instruments. I wasn't sure what. And she wanted, we were just about to get married when all this was going down, or just had been married. And she wanted to move to the East Coast to be near her family and her grandmother. And so I was looking for apprenticeships, and I wasn't sure what I was going to end up doing. So I thought I could end up working in some small town music store, pounding dents out of tubas, or because I started out as a sax player, and I played clarinet and flute. You can see there's an oboe right there. Or I don't even know how to play that. I don't even know where it came from. But I thought I could do that. I could learn a little bit how to play violin, and I could repair fiddles, and I could do whatever needs to be done. But just as we were about to move to the East Coast, I had already joined the Guild of American Luthiers. I was learning about guitar making, and Dana Bourgeois put an ad in the back saying, looking for workers, and we wanted to move to Maine, and he was in Lewiston, Maine. We're like, this is great, but he'll never hire me. I don't have any experience building guitars. But I did have machine shop experience, which it turned out was useful because I could chop things accurately. I could cut up parts, and he figured he could use me. And so I ended up basically having a job waiting for me when I arrived. And that solidified my trajectory, to guitar making, which is really what I wanted to do more than anything anyway.
Guitar school was in Canada, right?
Yeah, so before I arrived in Maine, I told Dana when I first met him, My wife and I were coming to the East Coast to be with her family for an event, and we stopped at one of the Asia symposiums where Dana was, and I talked to him, and basically begged him to hire me, expecting him to say no. But I said, I'm going to Canada. I'm going to take an intensive course with timeless instruments. I have taken recently beginning woodworking class, and I have machine shop experience. So I'm not totally green. I know how to do stuff, and I'm not afraid of machines, and I could be useful in a production shop. I'm not saying I'm a luthier, but I can make parts for you. That's all I was hoping, is just get my foot in the door. Okay. And he hired me, and it was a fantastic apprenticeship. Every time I get calls all the time and emails from people saying, "Hey, I want to get into instrument making. What do you recommend?" I said, get into a small factory. Mm-hmm. You will see production. You'll see how hard this work is. Maybe it's not for you. It's not for everybody. Not everybody's cut out for it. Not everybody can do the production part of it. Some people like the romance of it. Mm-hmm. Some people don't have the talent to just construct things. And getting into a small factory, you'll really figure out whether it's for you. And you learn so much from all the people around you. Mm-hmm. It was really ideal. Mm-hmm. And we were making really good stuff too. Mm-hmm. And I got to see a little bit it's so great because you're working on so many instruments. You're not building 10 guitars a year. Mm-hmm. You're building 10 guitars a week, at least in that setting. Which was small enough that you got to know each guitar. You could really, I would make note of certain woods that were unusual or that I wanted to know more about. I'd tag the production number, and then when the guitar got strung up, I'd tell the guys in the setup area, "Hey, come get me when that thing has strings on it. I want to hear it." And then I'd make notes. So it's a really great way to get to know what different woods do to the sound, because we're making the same models over and over and over again, and so you really get to see how different woods sound in the same model over and over and over again. Or I'll say, "Hey, this top was particularly heavy. Let me flag that one and go up and see how it sounds." Or this one was really light, or this one had a lot of flex along the grain, which is unusual. But we countered that by either leaving the bracing a little larger or leaving the area behind the bridge a little thicker. Interestingly, even in a factory like that, we were doing some of that. We were making some of those decisions. It's not like a large factory where you run it through a sander to a specific thickness and that's it. And every guitar gets the same treatment regardless of the wood. It was a small enough shop that we were making a lot of decisions. Dana, was really bringing Luthiers art into a factory setting was what we were trying to do. So it's a great way to learn. Okay. And Circa came about because at that same time, there was no internet. This was 1992, 93. I used to get catalogs, from the Gruen catalog of vintage instruments. And, I just looked through there for fun. And everything was circa 1870, circa 1890, before they could pinpoint the dates of a lot of instruments. And I thought, when I started my company, I wanted to build guitars that were vintagey, but with a slightly modern twist. Mm-hmm. And Circa generally, means kind of a time. Doesn't mean it's a museum grade copy. It's it has the vibe, which is exactly what I wanted to do with my guitars. I wasn't trying to make vintage guitars. I was trying to make a modern version of a vintage guitar. So Circa seemed right, and I didn't want to put Slobod, which is my last name, on the headstock. So that's how that all started.
So Circa guitars are often, praised for being both traditional and refined. So right. If you had to describe your building philosophy in just one word, what would it be?
In just one word? Yeah. Well, I in my ads, which I've only run a few ads, I need to run some new ads. I haven't run ads in years. The line was, find guitars in the vintage tradition. Mm-hmm. In the tradition, but not necessarily, I do a lot of my production is very, very close to what Martin was doing, in what we call the golden age, the late 20s to, maybe mid 40s or early 40s. So, but the guitars are not old. And there's some things that are different. And I'm not, I use a Collings style neck joint, which is 2 bolts in a tapered tenon that is not glued in, but the fretboard is glued down. And, I worked at Bourgeois, which is an entirely bolt-on system. I worked for Eric Schoenberg and Julius Borges, which is a traditional dovetail system. And the reason I chose the Collings system was because it has a lot of advantages without any of the drawbacks, really. And I watched Collings build thousands and thousands of guitars without issues. So I'm cautious. I don't go out and try new things unless I'm pretty sure they're going to work. And, looking at Collings doing it for 20 years, I was like, okay, this system works really well. And it has the advantages of gluing the fretboard down, that it's so stable, but it's easy to remove without steam. And
so quite a bit of inspiration from 25 to 30s Martin.
Yeah, that's the inspiration, but I'm not making stuff that's that dry.
Right.
And that's after talking with professionals who, I've encountered over the years. And that's something I did really early in my career. I was not bashful. I would go to shows with my guitar heroes and bring an instrument and ask them to critique it, not necessarily to try to sell them stuff. And that stuff was really useful. And some of these guys told me they could play vintage instruments, but they don't, because the vintage instruments, a lot of people don't know this, even though they're very lightly built sometimes, not always, there's a certain tension to them, which some people really love, which I really love. They even though the string gauge is the same I'm making a Martin copy basically, a lot of my guitars feel like there's a little less tension on the strings.
So you said it's Vintagey, and but so how do you reinterpret those qualities for today's player?
Well, part of it is the neck shapes. I offer a wide variety of neck shapes. Initially, when I first started building, my neck shapes were really thin because that's what was popular at the time. Then people started wanting thicker neck shapes, and for modern players, it's mostly about the sound. A lot of guys really dig vintage stuff, but and I, like I said, I'm a vintage fanatic. I love, in particular, Martins and Gibsons. But those guitars can be super dry and have a fair amount of tension. I love the mids, and I play, I'm a bad player, but I tend to play kind of hard, and it really works on those guitars. If you have a lighter touch, and again, this is, there's lots of old Martins that have a very light touch, depending on when they were built and how they're set up and all that. But there's a fullerness to the note. And there's a lot of reasons why that's happening in the old guitars, why they got to sound the way they do. It's not just the construction techniques, it's the age and the string tension and the shrinking of the lacquer over 70, 80 years. But Al Petaway was a guy who played a number of my guitars and worked for Dream Guitars and had access to tons of vintage stuff coming through there, and had a few vintage guitars at one point. He kind of went through a phase where he was really into them, but he ended up selling most of them and keeping the more modern stuff because he really loved the slightly fuller sound.
Yeah, the complex.
Yeah, it's a little more complex, but I'm not building, most people building high-end hand-built guitars these days are looking for a sound that is the opposite of vintage. Very responsive, not much headroom, a lot of complexity, a lot of low end, what I call pianistic guitar.
Right.
It has sparkling trebles and really deep low end, and everything rumbles for a long period of time, and that's just not what I want to build. I want to build something that's more Martin inspired, has a strong fundamental, is very dynamic in that you can play it lightly or loudly and it holds together. Very versatile guitars. That's one thing I love about them.
Okay.
They're not Urban Samaji is probably the extreme end of the spectrum in terms of building the responsive guitar, which is the title of his book. But that's not what I do. I'm much closer to the other end, the vintage spectrum, but I'm not all the way there. I like a guitar, like I said, with a strong fundamental and a strong mid-range as well, but just not as parched as a real vintage guitar. When I first came across a guitar built with hide glue, Julius Borges came up to the Bourgeois factory when he was just starting working with Eric Schoenberg, and he kind of wanted to see, the production process and get some ideas for tooling and jigs and stuff. And he had a guitar that he'd made, and it had a certain sweetness and musicality in the trebles that I wasn't hearing in what we were doing at Bourgeois. And so Julius and I talked a lot about I showed him what we were doing, and I said, well, what are you doing that's different? And there really isn't a lot of difference, but the subtle changes make a big difference. And one of the factors was there was no catalyzed finish on the top, and one of the factors was hide glue, and one of the other things was the tops were a little bit thinner. Not much, but you put all those together, and there were a few other construction details that probably played a role. Everything plays a small part, but the guitar to me in particular the trebles were more musical sounding, and so I was like, oh man, maybe. And then I read all this stuff about hide glue, and most of it was hype. People really misunderstand what hide glue does to the tone. They think because it dries really hard that it's going to make a loud, brash, bright instrument. It does the opposite. It I don't know why, but it does. It sweetens the notes. It makes them what I call a more organic note. Which steel string guitars, especially 14 fret steel string guitars, I think that's their Achilles heel musically, is that you have a string that's under a fair amount of tension, and it's not, and especially as you go up the neck, you have a short string under a lot of tension. And to get a short piece of steel under tension to have a musicality to it is difficult. And, they tend to get thin sounding, and that's where the hide glue and the thin nitro finish, I think, is really key, at least for the sound I'm after.
Are you also going for a bit thicker top, like the vintage Martins?
Not really. I'm not doing my tops as thin as we did when I was working with Julius. An OM top for Julius would have usually been around 107 thou to 112. Mine tend to be between 110 to anywhere up to 118, something like that, depending on the top. I'm currently using a fair amount of red spruce. Now we're talking about red spruce here. That's coming from a source where the wood is a little bit lighter in weight. So I'm tending to leave those tops a few thousandths of an inch thicker. So it's kind of like a really, really stiff piece of German spruce. So I want that fundamental. I don't want to lose the fundamental note of red spruce. But I'm really liking this slightly lighter red spruce that I've been using on the smaller guitars. And when I make dreadnoughts, I usually use heavier red spruce because you really want to weight that fundamental note down. You don't want that much airiness to it. You don't want complexity in a dreadnought, generally. I mean, if you're playing, bluegrass or picking it hard, you need some gravity to the notes to give clarity to it. Yeah. Otherwise, you get a lot of mud. So I wouldn't say my tops they're not thick by any means, but they're not. Some modern builders, especially the responsive guitar types, will take tops down to just so thin by my standards. 90 thousandths of an inch, something like that, 95.
Thicker than that, right?
Yeah, considerably thicker. Yeah, okay. And there's a lot of ways to approach this. You can leave the top thicker and use small braces. You can use larger braces and a thinner top. It's all about balancing the structure, obviously. You don't want the thing to fall apart, or you don't want it to move too much so that the neck needs resetting. But you're matching string tension to the top. And like I said, there are a lot of ways to get there in terms of graduating the top. In other words, thicknessing it in different areas, leaving it thicker in the middle. You can leave it thicker at the edges. All of that stuff works. It all makes interesting sounding guitars, but some of them have particular qualities for different styles of music that are, what people are looking for. My tops are fairly even across the whole top. I'm not doing a lot of top graduation, which when I first came up, Dana taught me to think of the top as a speaker, and thin the edges, because the edges are locked into the sides, so they're not moving much. So he was saying, if the top is too stiff, you can, and this was everybody was doing this back then, you thin the edges of the top to kind of loosen it up, but leaving the structural integrity of the center of the top, which I did for years. But eventually I came to the idea that I really wanted to do the opposite of that almost. I liked what I was getting when I left the top thick, especially near the tail block. That the stiffness between the block and the bridge, I think, gave the guitars a little bit more volume, a little bit more clarity. But there's a little bit of trade-off there too. They're a little bit less responsive. Okay. So I do tailor the tops, the top selection and the voicing of the top and the gray, whether the thicknessing of it in certain areas based on what the client wants, and it's not like I can just dial it in and out comes, the perfectly voiced guitar. They're more complex than that. Right. But I have a lot of tools at my disposal to kind of push the voicing. I've built OMs that have so many different types of voices, based on all those different things.
So we're talking oud here. So basically, when you're selecting oud, what's the most important factor for you? Like, tone, look, age, or something else?
Well, I'm really picky with wood, and then I think as you go on in this business, you find out you have to be picky if you want to make any money and get a good reputation. It doesn't pay to be a nice person and accept a bunch of second-grade wood from the wood dealers. I hate to say it, but it kind of pays to be a pain in the butt. I really, really hammer these guys about sending me clean wood, and when I can, I go to the source and dig through the stacks myself. That's the best way to do it, and I usually do that, actually. But the first thing I do is pick it up and flex it along the grain. Red spruce is almost always really stiff along the grain. Other species aren't. There's a lot of variation within the species. With red spruce, you pick it up, it's always stiff along the grain. If it's cut right, it'll be stiff across the grain as well. If it goes off quarter, then it tends to get floppy. Red spruce is funny that if it's floppy at the edges, it doesn't tend to affect the tone that much. Whereas with other spruces, it really does. I think this is one reason Martin's guitars were so consistent prior to 1946. And after that, they become very inconsistent because they were using Sitka. Sitka can be incredibly heavy, it can be incredibly light, it can be incredibly stiff, it can be very flexible. It's just like 5 or 6 different species within the same, heading. And I don't think Martin paid, for some reason, they didn't pay that much attention to it, it seems to me, because you get guitars with massive braces that are collapsing, and then just a few years earlier, they were using small braces on Red Spruce top guitars that are doing great. But with the tops, I do pay a lot of attention to the visual aspect of it, the looks, because my clients are paying a certain amount of money. They expect the guitars to have a certain look to them. So I don't use top wood, even if it would sound fantastic, if it has streaky stuff or color or birefraction. And I have tons of tops that I have paid a lot of money for that I just can't use. Just because my guitars are at a certain place in the market where they have to be stellar. There's no reason to ever compromise on that stuff. And I do tap the tops when I'm selecting them, but it doesn't really, it's not I'm always picking out stuff that has a vibrant tone to it, but I'm not convinced that that is really going to have that much bearing on whether the top is going to be great or not. Because a lot of tops, the thickness of the top or the length of it and the width can kind of really impact its tap tone when you're just like going through a stack quickly. And you can have one that kind of feels a little funky, and then you get it home and you sand it and you prep it and you're like, oh, this thing is fantastic. So I'm mostly picking wood that has the right weight, it looks good, and it's very, very stiff. And then I do, this little tap, and it's got to have if it sounds dull and I'm in a stack and, I'm just going to put that one aside just because why take a chance on it? But by the time I'm here and evaluating stuff, then I'm doing a lot of things, like I'm tapping it, I'm feeling it, I'm flexing it. I don't measure top deflection. I use my hands for that. And I pay a lot of attention to top deflection in choosing a top for a double O versus a triple O or a dreadnought. There's a lot of decisions being made on how stiff the top is based on what guitar I'm going to make. But I'm not saying, okay, for this model, I always want this amount of deflection, and I don't care if it's a stiff top or a flexible top. I'm just going to get the same amount of deflection, by leaving it thicker. I don't do that. I'm doing it with my thumbs mostly, but I'm not taking notes and measuring that way, like a lot of people do.
So it depends on your feeling.
Yeah, yeah, and that's where working at a small factory was great, because I got to flex thousands of tops, literally, and then see. And I took a lot of notes early on in my career, especially when I was working for Julius. We had a terrible time finding good red spruce back then. This is in 1999 and 2000. We had to use wood that we didn't want to use. We couldn't get great red spruce back then. And so I made a ton of notes we had tops that were super flexible, which I expected to sound bad, that sounded amazing. Other tops that were super stiff that, maybe didn't speak to me in the way I thought they would. So I did learn a lot, but I also learned that sometimes wood can surprise you. It's a very complex system, and you don't always know, why things are going to go the way they go. The other thing that I will say about tops is that I'm super picky about it because I need to be consistent. That's a major reason I'm successful in this business, is people know there's a certain sound and characteristic to my guitars. And I've been told by a lot of pros that mine are among the most consistent guitars they've played. And that's important to me.
And speaking about tonute, you're trying to use exotic new kind of tonute, like Royal Mecca Ebony.
Yeah, sometimes.
Like Pernambuco.
Yeah, occasionally. I mean, and the back and side wood is very important to the sound, but to me, the quality of the guitar comes from the top. The color of the sound comes from the back and sides. Right. Now, obviously, there's extremes. You can go with, on one side, you've got walnut and maple, which are very dull sounding woods if you tap them, but they can make fabulous guitars, which have a unique characteristic. you know, and then at the other extreme is like African blackwood.
I saw the picture that you got there on the Facebook.
Oh yeah.
So that's the new project.
I've used it on maybe 3 guitars so far.
You did?
Yeah, it's an interesting wood. It's really interesting.
Heavy wood.
Extremely heavy, and it can tap like glass, like just crystal. It's a Dalbergia. It's not an ebony. It's an actual rosewood, but it makes interesting sounding guitars. It tends to have a really strong low end, a little bit like Cocobolo, but a little bit more complex sounding than Cocobolo. Cocobolo, I love Cocobolo, especially for small guitars, because of its strong low end, but it also has kind of a vintagey mid-range. It's not too complex, but if you want something more complex with like that Cocobolo low bottom end, African Blackwood is great.
So those would be go with German spruce top?
Yeah, oh sure. Yeah.
The Adirondack will be a bit hard, right?
No, it'll work. Yeah, I would probably thin it more, you know, than I might. It depends on what the player wants. And I haven't built with it that much. We did build a number of guitars with African Blackwood when we did like this anniversary model when I was at Bourgeois, and they were among the strangest guitars I've ever played. One of them went to Ricky Skaggs, which he used, you know, when he was like on TV. He would always play this fancy guitar that Dana built him. But we built a small number of African Blackwood guitars with this German spruce that had a lot of bear claw in it that we got from a classical builder here in Maine. And really good wood all around, but they were such strange guitars. Dana never made other guitars that sounded quite like those. I couldn't tell whether it was the blackwood or the weird top wood, or they had abalone nuts and saddles. You know, there's a lot of factors going on. Hard to pinpoint it, but they were very strange guitars. They were good. They were really cool, but they didn't sound like anything else I'd ever heard. Now the guitars I've built out of it sound pretty much like, you know, normal Circa guitars.
Yeah.
They didn't sound that wild. Yeah. You know, they just sounded like Circa guitars that had a little more heft to them and a little bit more, you know, emphasis on the low end.
So when I'm thinking of your guitar, basically 2 models, like, you know, the OM and Triple O are especially popular among your guitars. So can you explain the main differences between the 2?
Well, sure. The OM model evolved directly out of the 12-fret Triple O. And there's a long story and there's a lot of history, some of which has just come out recently about the OM and its evolution with Perry Bechtel. But generally what they did was a lot of people don't know this, they took the Triple O and they have the lower bout and then they have the waist. And in the upper bout, the Triple O 12 fret, we're talking about here, to be clear, has a fairly long classical style upper bout. What they did was they shortened it by 1 fret, not 2. And then they slid the neck out 1 fret. So now you have a body joint at the 14th fret, all things being equal. So they only shortened the body by 1 fret, but then they moved the neck out. So that changes the positioning. Your bridge goes with the neck. So when you move the neck, you're moving the bridge up toward the top of the guitar. And when you move the bridge, you have to move the bracing with it. So the bracing is in a different position relative to the lower bout. So 12 fret guitars sound different because of that. The bridge is in a slightly more efficient place to transfer string energy into movement. And it just changes it opens up and loosens up the top a little bit. So that's the main difference, is that the 12 frets tend to be a little sweeter. There's a little bit, now there's the same amount of string tension. If you, on a 12 fret Triple O, traditionally with Martin, it's a 25.4 scale, and the same for the OM. So the tension on the top is the same, the string tension is the same, but the guitars feel a little bit looser. Even in your hands, like the tension and everything feels a little looser. The the way the instrument responds to you is a little bit looser, a little freer. All things being equal, like with, but some people like the OMs, not just because of the extra access up the neck, but because they don't want a guitar that's loose. They want a guitar that has a little tension in it, for various reasons. So those are the main differences, is that you get a slightly sweeter sound. The trebles, especially the high E string and B string up the neck, tend to be a little more musical sounding on a 12 fretter, partly because of the way the top is moving and freed up a little bit. But that's the evolution of it. And I have tried. I actually, early in my career, my OMs were a little bit inconsistent. It took me a while to kind of dial them in. And now they're really, they've been great for a long time. They've been really coming out, like everyone has been good. But they're a slightly harder instrument to make great, I think. A 12 fretter kind of gives you a little bit of an edge in terms of, it's hard to kind of mess it up because it's such an efficient design already. Whereas the 14 fret guitars, like an OM, like a long scale OM, you really got to nail it to make it great. You really have to fine tune the tension on the top in your voicing.
So if a client wants to describe the sound they're looking for, what's the best way for them to communicate that to you?
That's a good question. It helps if they have, if they've played a Circa before, that's useful. If they haven't, then we usually talk about guitars they have played that I'm familiar with. Tell me what you are playing now. Let me know what instruments you have played in the past, what ones you like. Tell me, how do you describe a mahogany guitar versus a rosewood guitar? Once I hear how they describe that, then I can understand what they're trying to communicate to me. Some clients have a number of guitars, and they want a rosewood sound on one guitar. They want like a sort of a really dry sound or mahogany on another thing, or they have a large guitar, they want a small guitar. I try to figure out whether or not I'm building them, like they're going to have one or two great guitars in their collection and they want this to be super versatile, or whether they want me to like really move it in one direction, not necessarily be a versatile instrument, but be really fine-tuned for a specific need. So that's the first thing I try to determine is, like what role is this guitar going to play in your either collection, or is it just going to be like you're selling a couple guitars and you're going to get your one dream guitar. And so if that's the case, tell me what kind of music you play. Is it a wide variety of stuff? Are you specializing in little Celtic, tunes, or are you, playing Blind Blake stuff? And then I can get a feel for the direction I want to take the voicing. And then we talk about wood and, pricing on the wood, sound of the wood, the aesthetics. Wood selection has to do with, getting the customer the aesthetic look they want and also the sound they want. My main task is the way I communicate with people, I found that, some people say, this guitar is bright, and another person will say something completely other. I don't really care about the terminology. I just want to know what they're playing, and so I can get an idea of, I know what they're describing. I don't care what words we're using, but I have a pretty good idea of what the sound that they're hearing. And if they say, this is what I want, or I want to push it in a slightly different direction from that, then I'm pretty confident that I can determine, where we want to go.
Okay. So that's basically custom building. But if a client wants the signature sound of Circa guitar.
Oh, okay.
Then what's
Yeah.
your
Well, then
explanation?
Well, you know, a new guitar in a vintage tradition. So it has the fundamental notes of a traditional Martin style guitar, a certain dryness in the mid-range, especially as the guitars age. Brand new guitars don't have a lot of mid-range and a lot of dryness. But they get that fairly quickly as the top gets used to being under tension and the lacquer hardens a bit more. I describe the Circa sound as basically a Martin sound with a little bit more warmth. And you know, when I say the Martin sound, I'm talking about like a vintage Martin sound.
You said mid-dry a lot.
I do, yeah. Although, you know, compared to modern builders, I have more. My guitars tend to emphasize mid-range, and the mid-range is the dry portion of the sound of the guitars, in my opinion. Mid-range is where it's at, and I talk to all these when I'm talking to like really good players or professionals who are touring. When we're talking guitars, I say I like mid-range, and they almost invariably say, yes, that's where it's at. People don't understand that. Mid-range is what makes guitars great, because steel string guitars have a built-in low end and high end. The high end isn't always musical, but getting the mids in there will give you a guitar that has great balance, and that's what musicians want, whether they know it or not. Obviously the tonality, the character of the tone has to be good as well. But what a lot of modern guitars are lacking for a lot of players is that balance.
All right, so let's talk about your building process.
Yeah.
So I've been working together with you almost 10 years now.
Yeah, wow,
So
yeah.
you know,
Nice. Thank you.
yeah, I've watched your OCD pattern
Oh,
a
yeah.
lot, and so it's
Yeah.
clear that you put a lot of care into the details. So which stage of the building process usually takes the most of your time?
The last 40%. It's funny, I come from a production background. I was building guitar bodies at Bourgeois. I was binding. And when I worked for Schoenberg and Julius, I built bodies. And I'm tooled up to do that. I use a lot of the same type of jigs that Dana developed before he even opened his factory. He was really pretty smart about that. I stole a lot of stuff from Dana. And it was transferable to a small shop like mine. You know, you could set up a router table and a couple of clever clamping techniques, and you can crank out braces. You know, you can do a lot of work on the braces very quickly. In fact, the past couple of weeks ago, my son was in here cranking out basically a 10-year supply of back braces.
Wow.
I may never have to make back braces again. We'll see, because I'm 62. So we'll see. But he made hundreds of back braces. And I'm going to have him doing X braces soon. So that can come together really quickly. I can build a body pretty quickly. The process is drawn out partly because I like to de-stress things. You know, I take the wood. When I start a guitar, once we've decided on everything, and the guitar is going to be in the next batch, I'll join 10 tops and backs, and then I'll thickness them to a certain point, and then I just sticker them. My wood blocker is humidity controlled, and most of the wood in there is over a decade old, and everything is stable and dry. But before I'm going to use it, I sticker it, and I try to leave it in there, and I actually lower the humidity in the wood room a little bit extra, and I put a small fan on it and let it sit for a month or two, which is probably completely unnecessary, but I try to stress the wood a tiny bit. I keep that room then in the upper 30% humidity wise, and that's where I brace. That's the humidity that I brace at. But I'm digressing again. But so that I could build a body very quickly, but I'm saying it takes a long time because I slow the process down on purpose to condition the wood. And then finally, once that's done, I can brace tops fairly quickly, brace backs very quickly. I always build rims first. That's the sides. I do that first, and then I do the bracing because I don't want to leave the plates braced and not locked in to a body shape. The backs in particular can distort. Tops, it's really not a problem. You could brace a top now and then use it 10 years from now and it would probably be fine. But backs will distort heavily on you because they're kind of pushed into a dish that's unnatural, and then you put struts only on one side. And I know they will distort because I found out the hard way. Early in my career, I made a bunch of bodies that I didn't end up finishing for a long time because I started getting commissions. And I had to shave all the braces off those guitars and start over when I did eventually use them. But the slowest process is really like getting to the finish line, getting through finish. I wait a very long time for the lacquer to harden, and then the setup takes a while, and I wait a long time. I let my guitars sit for quite a long time after stringing them before doing final setup work and final neck adjustments and final fret leveling and saddle adjustments and all that. So that also, once you get closer to the end, little things that go a little bit wrong set you back a long time, especially if you're finishing with nitro and you have to do little touch-ups here, little drop fills. They can really take a long time. There's lots of shortcuts that you can take, which I don't like to do because they have issues. So that's where things get stretched out. It's not like a production setting where I have catalyzed finishes that I can just like spray quickly and sand it out 2 days later and buff it and hope for the best. That part really does drag, sadly. But while that's happening, I'm starting the next batch, so I'm staying busy.
So some of our fine Luthiers clients are considering Circa as their very first high-end Luthier built guitar.
Yeah.
What advice would you give them?
The biggest thing is just have a clear idea of what you want, because the more you can think about it, the more other instruments you can play. Whenever I'm talking with a client directly, I always say, play a bunch of stuff, have fun. Some people know exactly what they want. They've been around a long time. They've had quite a few guitars. And they're like, I've always wanted one of these, or I had one and I sold it a long time ago. I want something like that. They have I've always wanted like a 1932 OM copy. They know just what they want. They know the sound. They know the aesthetics. But other people are like, I don't know. I really encourage them to play a bunch of different types of woods, play different types of guitars, and just, decide, really focus on what it is that's going to make them happy. And then I can, because I can't build them what they want if they don't know. That's the main thing.
And
so if you're a first-time guy, that's the main thing. It's just have some fun before you place the order, and do some thinking and playing all sorts of things. I call it the petting zoo for guitars. Go play a bunch of stuff.
For that aspect, what kind of playing styles or genres do you feel Circa guitars are especially suited for?
Not to be a cop-out, but a lot of stuff. I have built, one of the things I'm known for is building guitars that are fairly versatile. So that immediately means that they can do a lot of different things. But I also, part of what I do as an individual luthier, not just making high-quality guitars in a factory setting, is I am pushing my designs. Like, I'm mostly doing Martin body shapes and styles. I do a few models on my own. But let's just take an OM, which is a very standard guitar that everybody's pretty familiar with. I have made really dry, bright OM 18s. I've made OMs that are really open and delicately braced and have a sort of pianistic, resonant quality to them. I've done, like pretty dry pre-war style ones with bar frets that had like a really, when I talk about those dry mid-range, you know, I can do that. And I even changed like the arching of the tops and the, you know, there's a lot of different changes that I make. I don't just like make an OM a certain way. You know, so and for Steve Boffman, the Celtic guitarist, I made some large guitars that are very different from my normal style. They're what I would call the modern pianistic type of guitar. You know, lots of overtones, huge low end, not a lot of headroom, very, very different from what I'm normally doing. So, not to say I can do everything, and I have turned down orders, by the way. I've said, you know, I'm not really building in that style. You know, I have some friends. Let me give you some names. Go see them. But I can. One of the things I love about Martin, and one of the reasons I ended up copying mostly Martin stuff, is because I felt those were such diverse and there were guitars that you could play so many different styles on. And I do everything from single O's all the way up to dreadnoughts and 12 fret dreadnoughts. So, you know, there's a lot to work with there.
You got 7/8.
Yeah. I got the 7/8 dread, which I've done. I made a 7/8 dread for a bluegrasser in Britain, who wanted basically a D18, and the 7/8 dread is also the model I used to create Steve Boffman's guitar, which is kind of like a, you know, like something coming out of the Samaji school, sound-wise.
For that, are there any new projects or designs you'd love to try in the future?
Well, some of the newer projects I've done are things that I've wanted to do for 25 years or more, which is I did the birdbeak neck joint, which was something that Martin did all the way up to 1915. And I also, it took forever, I did a project where I was making style 30 purfling, which is a style that was also done in the late 19th century. I've done a couple other oddball things. I did sort of a modern style guitar, not Martin shaped at all. I've done a couple that I call the OMX, which is a large lower bout modern guitar with modern aesthetics. Doesn't look like a vintage guitar, and that had a very different sound as well. Kept the tops thinner, non-scalloped bracing. You know, the whole completely different style thing, just for fun. But I don't know. The next thing I want to do is actually move backwards in time and do some guitars based on these like late 1880s, 1890s style guitars. But they are not going to be replicas, because I'm going to voice them and brace them for modern light gauge strings. So it'll have the aesthetics of a parlor guitar from Martin in the 1880s, and with a lot of the features that I think are so gorgeous, like the birdbeak necks and the custom purflings and stuff like that. And the weight, that's another thing, is people love the weight of them because they don't have truss rods, just a graphite bar on the neck or bar frets. But you know, in keeping the finishes really, really, really thin. I've been working on getting my finishes thinner. I've been doing certain things that are a little bit more vintage than my normal Circa stuff. You know, basically flat tops, slightly thinner, super thin finishes. You know, just going for that vibe a little bit more. And maybe I haven't done any relicking yet, but I might do some relicking in the future, which would be new for me. So, and I'm sure the learning curve on that would be crazy and drive me nuts. But you know, so that's something that I might do. But right now, I'm just trying to get people guitars on time, which I never can.
You're the Slobod.
I am. I really am. I've had some health issues that have really impacted that. Long COVID really did a number on me. So I'm trying to get that back. And this year it's been pretty productive. I'm cranking out a pretty big batch right now. It's going great.
So finally, do you have a message you'd like to share with guitar enthusiasts in Korea and fine Luthiers clients?
Well, with fun Luthiers clients, yeah, just thank you. You guys have been really supportive, always ordering really fun guitars to build, really nice stuff. Yeah, I'd love to get over there sometime and like do something in your shop. And the only thing I would say is don't worry too much about your guitars. Have fun with them. You know, they're just tools for having fun with. And I like seeing guitars a little beat up. It means people are just using them for fun, which is, you know, that's the main thing. Enjoy the music. What?
You don't do Reddits.
No, but maybe I will because that I'll start doing relics because that way people can't be too fancy with them, you know.